here began the second major portion of the book of 1 Corinthians. And as we mentioned last week, it has a nice transition, because the two main parts that were addressed in the first part, in chapters 1 through 6, were problems of division, and then also problems of immorality, and specifically a problem of fornication. And having addressed that problem, then he transitions to this answering the things that they have proposed and the questions that they have that began in chapter 7 and will continue through really most of the rest of the book. So in doing that, he moved from this problem of fornication on the negative side to addressing questions and situations on the positive that have to do with marriage itself. So what we saw beginning in verse 1 was posing this idea, and we looked at his quotation, which he regularly will do throughout this book, of the idea of, well, fornication is wrong, so it would be wrong for a man to ever touch a woman at all, right? And he's saying, no, that's not what I said. Why? Because marriage. And that, as we looked in verses 2 through 5, he then gives a defense of, an explanation of sexual conduct within marriage. And in doing so, he shows that this is in opposite of sexual immorality or fornication, and that God had already provided for this in the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, of one man, one woman, okay? And that was proper. But then, as we looked in verse 3, that depends on having the right attitude toward one another, in how you conduct yourself, and this is still within a sexual context then, and that ties in then with verse 4, on then in the relationship itself. And you need to note that what often is so missed out on here is every single one of these, if you think about what's going on in verse 2, I just want to read it this way and see if you catch this. In verse 2, let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. Okay? Works both ways. Let the husband render to his wife the affection to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. It works both ways. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. It works both ways. Do not deprive one another, verse 5, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fast and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now here it's not both ways, it is the word consent. That is it. What I want you to see is in each one of those verses, there was a reciprocity, a reflexive nature of all this. It was something where they were both involved, and it was a giving to the other equally. It was one of these things of where properly and maturing in this way, that there is, you have fully a relationship in which no one dominates the other sexually. It is totally an understanding of the other and giving yourself, because of your love for the other, to your spouse. And that he is showing that, and that then he comes down at this end, and this gets us to where we're going here in verse 6, is at the end here of verse 5 when he says this idea of don't do this except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Fasting is not in every translation. But the whole idea is to a spiritual purpose. So, okay, you're going to go over here and I'm going to leave for a while, so there's a time, but come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so you're understanding that this should not ever be done in which it would harm the relationship for either one. Okay? That there's a mindset in which this goes with marriage, and that therefore that has to be a consideration in all you do and how you behave and interact in marriage. That's what verses 2 through 5 get to. Now, when we get into verse 6, then, in verse 7, we end up with an interesting problem. We think we just can read right on through this and there's no issue at all, but actually trying to figure out a simple thing as what this refers to creates all sorts of problems for us. Okay? So again, we have to make sure that we're not just playing guessing games, we're trying to figure this out. Because he says, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. So we have to figure out which one is the concession. What is he saying is not commanded, but is a concession? Is he talking about, and this is argued back and forth, there are actually, I think, 5 different views that people have put out there, but there are 2 main ones. And it would be, well, he's talking about getting married. Now, if we have to eliminate any that would argue against what he said in verses 2 through 5. Okay, so it says sexual behavior in marriage. He said, this is what you're to do. So it can't be that's just a concession and you're not commanded that. He just commanded it. Okay, so we do away with that. The 2 ideas would be, though, that I think would have some merit, would be the necessity of marriage. Is that you do not have to get married. Okay, that the idea of being married itself is not required in order to be a Christian, to be pleasing to God. It's not required. Okay, that would be one. The other way to look at this is that it's referring, because of the connection with the idea of consent, is that concession and consent, even though it's not the same word, that they might be related, and he's referring to there's no necessity that couples take time off. Either one of those explanations, I think, are possible. The others, I don't think, really merit much discussion. But either one of those would, and it would not be as a commandment. You're not commanded to marry, and in marriage, you're not commanded to take time off from your sexual relationship for this. That's not required. Neither one of those, both those would hold up in terms of context. But then you come down, and we've got a different problem beginning in verse 7. He says, and listen carefully as you read in your translation, "For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." Now, if we take that, did you hear the difference? Did anybody have in a different translation, it start with a different word? Yet? Okay. Or how about, does anyone have but would be another possibility? Okay. There's a disagreement in the manuscripts on what the word is here about the conjunction. Now, ordinarily, you would think this would be a rather small thing, wouldn't you? You know, just the difference between for and but. That's the difference, essentially. Well, that's actually kind of a big deal as far as how you interpret this. And so, depending upon your translation, and that is going to depend on the manuscripts that they used. For those who are keeping score with such things, the evidence is rather mixed on this, including in the ancient, the older manuscripts are pretty mixed as far as they have evidence of both. The later manuscripts, the majority of manuscripts have for. So until you get into where you want to have a preference over the Chester Beatty papyri, if that's your thing, don't really think it is from this crowd, right? I might go to some conference somewhere and says, "I love the Chester Beatty papyri," and that person has a problem. I'm just telling you. Okay, it's silly, right? Okay, but y'all don't even know what I'm talking about. All right. I'm going to line up all these different, you get to line up all these different people that have copied 1 Corinthians, and half of them say one thing and half of them say the other, and this, well, actually a lot more than half say another thing, but these are all older, but some of these are old too, and we don't know. There you go. You're welcome. Yes. Well, the answer is yes, because we can't know. And this, the key thing here, and I like to use instances of this. You notice that, does it affect the meaning of this passage? Yes, it does. Is it going to change some doctrinal thing? Not at all. Okay, and it's a great example of the realities you face in textual criticism. And that is, you have to face that we do not have any of the original manuscripts, okay, that we call them the autographs. We don't have what Paul's pen, what it actually, well, he would have used in amanuensis, but we don't have that, okay? We have copies of that. And we have copies of copies of copies of copies of that. So we're kind of removed from it some, and they sometimes made mistakes. What we don't know is, in every instance, as to why those mistakes exist. Was it just a genuine error? Did someone change it deliberately? Or did they hear it wrong, see it wrong? This looks more like they were trying to keep it in context, but and the contextual explanation then of the early church fathers you go check into. I know you're thinking I'm really complicating this, but I'm really just trying to explain why it's a problem. Okay, but what we have to do is accept then that, depending upon what your translation is, you're going to be thinking it's one way or the other. And you just need to be aware that sometimes those differences exist. And so aware and consider how that affects it. All right? So, when he says then, for I wish that all men were even as myself, that would lend itself toward the interpretation that he's referring to singleness in verse 6. If you have but there, it would give the idea more that she's referring to the phrasing of verse 5 and the time away that you'd spend away from one another. Okay? So that's why those two differences exist. And when you go to, here's why. When you go to commentaries, if the commentary follows a particular manuscript group, they're going to automatically be biased in their explanation of this passage and what they tell you it means, because of what they're looking at as a translation as the Greek. You need to be aware of that, so otherwise you are becoming subject to, unwittingly, someone's opinion, and you're taking it as absolute when there's actually a big question about it. That's why I go through to explain these things, so that you know to look for some of those differences when you see those and why it is different. Okay? So notice, either one of those differences, explanations, fit within the context and fit generally what is said elsewhere. You're not required to marry, and you're not required within marriage to take time off sexually. Both of those things can be substantiated elsewhere. Okay? So it doesn't affect something, it's just the specifics of the text. John? There were arranged marriages, which we'll get to at the end, toward the end of this chapter. And I would say that probably played in the verses 2 through 5 were probably more important in regard to arranged marriages than even this was. Okay, and it's not required. The other thing, though, is there'll be some background we get to, and I'll go ahead and bring it up since you brought that up and asked, that when Paul says he's going to be referring to the current distress midway through this chapter. We got a problem going on. And that is informing his recommendations. He's going to have both, here's biblically what I'm telling you, and then there's going to be, in some cases, here's what I'm advising you because of certain situations. So that situation, if you want to preview, is I saw some research done a few years ago that when this would have been written, that there was, it would appear, a local famine, which would have been short term. But that would have been a very difficult time in which to marry. Okay, so when we get to that portion of when that comes up, remind me. But that's a potential problem. The other possibility is because this was written in 55. At 54 AD is when you would have had Nero come on. Claudius dies, and Nero comes on the scene. Now, when that happened in the Roman Empire, you had to have the new emperor would then give decrees that kind of laid out all his agreement and just kind of pushed everything forward that had been done before, those kind of things. And it could have been waiting on that. Seems like for a year they should have had time to get that information, but that's at least possible. All right. So let me see. We've covered textual criticism. We've covered translation. We've covered history, Roman history. How about we get back to 1 Corinthians, okay? Now, yeah, oh, John once doesn't want to. Sorry, it's John's fault. Yes? Why does he interject? Why did he say, but I say this as a concession as a commandment, or does he interject, for I wish that all men were even as myself? Okay, that's the question. It depends on whether or not you take this as for or but, which is a matter of the text. So if it's but, I wish that he's making a difference, that you would take that time and that would be better for you. It could be for in saying, I wish that all men were even myself, and it's a more general thing because of what he says next, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that manner. Now, this is going to take a little bit more context, okay? What is the gift from God that each one has, and it's different? I'm going to make a structural argument now, okay? Meaning for the text. What is this entire section going to be dealing with? The very next thing he starts with is, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows. And then he's going to come back in verse 10 and say, now to the married I command. Now, that's going to actually continue, and you're going to get another situation in 14. So what you end up having is a series of situations, and that's actually continues through this chapter. He's addressing a variety of situations that can come up being married or not married. It all revolves around that. And I think because of the overall spread of this chapter, that he's addressing this situation and say, okay, now we started with marriage itself, as far as understanding that sexual activity within marriage is good and proper in God's sight. Okay, but now we're going to turn to some other situations. So but it's not required. So if we take it that way and say, but it's not required, okay, then, say the difference, but I wish everyone could be as I am, okay. Well, what does that mean? But at the same time, each one pretty much has his own gift. Now, that's an interesting, you can't get caught up too much on the words here. The word is charisma, which is, that's the word that's used later on of spiritual gifts. That's not what this is talking about. Okay. The word means, okay, you break it down. I really probably should start using the screen, but then you just really hate me, so I'll show you some of this. Okay, you go up and it says, charisma, the first 5 letters are charis, which is the word grace. Okay, it's the word grace. You add 2 more letters, which is ma, onto it, and that tends to give it the result of. That's why you have the idea of gift there. So it's going back to the favor, you've had the result of favor shown. So it's the idea of gift. It's actually something you've had this particular opportunity. All right? The opportunities are different. Situations are different. That's why I think that idea matches well with, don't get into this idea of that everybody should be celibate or everybody has to be married, but situations are different. And in some situations, it depends on the situation, what is called for. Okay? And I think that actually matches both the context, the structure, and the wording here in verse 7. Okay? Y'all are going to let me move on just because you're afraid of what I might do next. Right. Okay. So verse 8. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, okay, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, and that is a theme as well throughout this, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And that last one, as a translation problem, is we're going to get to. But okay, so now we're going to combine this now. We're going to say to the unmarried, so if you're single or widowed. So, what do we do with this situation? It's good for them if they remain even as I am. Notice the way he words this. It's good. It's not required. It's good for them. Now, he doesn't go in right here as to why. Okay? But it is generally, it would be good. So the question is it, what we have to watch out for is this idea of where you can see where some people would take this. You end up with the idea of celibacy that ends up in the Catholic Church and priesthood and all that. You can see that from this. But of course, in 1 Timothy chapter 4:1, we have and what follows, this very author, Paul, is talking about people who would later on command such that, and they were wrong to do that. Okay? So we know that's not what he could be saying here. Okay, John? Yes. Okay, and that's good. If anyone, the levirate marriage law, now, that was under the old law. We're dealing with, in Corinth, you've got a lot more of a Gentile background, but the levirate law probably preceded even the Jewish law, okay? So it would make sense that that still did exist, though you don't really see that practiced by others much. But if that were the case, the whole idea is he's taken away pressure here to marry, that you have to marry. Paco. Some of them, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that goes back to the you get focused, right? You need to grow more. Yeah. So we need to make sure we understand who he's talking about. Okay, it's good for them if they remain even as I am. Now that tells you something about Paul. Now people have spent all sorts of, we're talking about major scholarly papers written trying to figure out if Paul was ever married. I kid you not. Okay, so, but let's look at what three, I think, reasonable options, any of which would be possible, okay? Could be he was just single and never married. Now, it depends on, part of this and the reasoning depends on someone in his situation as a Pharisee of high standing, which he would have been as a Jew. Depending upon how old you think he would have been, they were required to be married if they were going to serve on the Sanhedrin. So in terms of career rise, it would have been made sense for him to be married. Okay, that would be one of those things. So that's one of the reasons people would say, well, he's probably married at one time. Okay, if he's married at one time, then you got different options, right? One would be that his wife passed away, and therefore he is going about his business and just staying single like he told those who were widowed to do here. It is also possible, looking ahead just a few verses, and I don't know that I've seen this in the literature, it is possible that he was married, and when he converted, considering how strongly he was a Jew beforehand, that his wife didn't take the news so kindly and left him. And he's going to deal with that part too coming up. Any one of these is possible. Now here's where we go back to what I said about the other. We can't know. And now I follow that with, it doesn't matter. Okay? That's right. Why? Because that part isn't necessary in order to understand what he's writing. Okay? But we need to say, right at the current time, he is single. That's what he is saying. Because he's making a contrast here that you need to stay. It's to be a good thing for you. And the reasons why we'll get to, as Paco was pointing out, they remain even as I am. Okay? That would be of benefit spiritually, for one thing. Okay. There's also, dependent upon if you end up with this other situation, coming up, that it would have been a problem. But notice verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, and that is just simply one of those things of that this doesn't automatically mean anything untoward, like there's been a problem, okay, with their interaction. It's just that they're in love and don't want to wait. Okay, no, I really love this person. Okay, and now he's going to come back to this in a different context with addressing, and that's a whole different problem with the fathers later on. Okay, but these are people who have the ability to decide for themselves. Okay, but if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. Okay, now, all right. So here's again goes back to the idea of concession. If that concession were single versus married, it doesn't matter. Okay. But the last part is more difficult. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, in the New King James, which I just read, I want to emphasize that with passion is in italics, which means that's not necessarily something that the Greek tells you. All right? So, depending upon your translation, okay, I'll tell you literally what this can mean. It can be translated, it is better to marry than to be burned. Now, there's a usage of this, even though that's the most literal translation, there is a usage of this where it would be understood in a more of a reflexive way that you would be burned kind of up within, that it's allowed. And that's what they're taking this as. What does that give us options as, though? It's really nice that 1 Corinthians is such a easy, not confusing book. But it means the options are either talking about contextually, and I think that's what they said contextually, this is what they thought it would be, that he's dealing with self-control, so it is better to be able to put that in its proper context where it's allowed, as he pointed out, verses 2 through 5, than to end up in a situation. What does it mean to burn with passion? Why is it better to marry than to burn with passion? Now, I understand there's some people here that this is when people make the wrong conclusion about it. Like, I'm pretty passionate about my wife. I just want to put that on the record. That doesn't go away just because you're married. Okay, so what is he talking about here? It could lead to sin. Okay, so if that's the case, then he could be talking about being burned as being within a metaphor of punishment. Now the question is that the typical understanding that you would have of a punishment? We would understand hell, but that tended to be more of a Jewish concept than what specifically the Greeks would have. So it becomes more difficult. And I think that's why they ended up translating it this way. John? That's right. And which he comes back to in a different way later on. Yeah, and it is better. It's also, the thing is the idea of the burning, though, does that mean definitely something untowards has happened? Or is it just you're consumed by it? Okay? You see what I'm saying? Is that if you are deeply in love but you can't marry, you're very passionate, what ends up happening? Or what can happen? Yes, you have all the temptations there, and he's in the context of self-control. Absolutely. That's right, you get distracted. So I want you to understand all these options, that you can go in the idea of you are totally distracted, and therefore you're not able to concentrate on what you need to do for God. You're not going to grow. Notice this thing, and Paco brought it up, but you have a number of things inserted here that he is really doing, I think, is saying, all of this marriage is right and this relationship is right, but in all of these things, single or married, you don't want to do something that is actually going to affect your spirituality, your relationship with God negatively. And that is actually the theme he's addressing as a subtext throughout. That's really what he's got going on, is that both of these can be correct situations. The question, though, is, are you handling them in such a way as to make sure that you're prioritizing your relationship with God and behaving properly in whichever one of the situations you happen to be in? John? It does affect, well, that's true. I mean, no, understand, no, they didn't have a metroplex, but Corinth was pretty big. For its day, it was a pretty large city. But they were called on as a church to be close-knit and to know what was going on. So you have a lot, and I think when you go through all this, that actually would explain better when it says it's good for them if they remain even as I am. Why? Because there's no question in terms of his priority. That's what it's total devotion. Because he's going to get back to this about the problems later on that come in when you are married. That there are some other things that come up. All right? All right, everyone, now I want you to go back and take a look at these verses, and you write down the questions that you now have that you did not have when you read them before class this morning. Okay. It's an odd place to divide it in a sense. It's a hard call because now he's moving on to the married in verse 10, but structurally we see all these situations developing. So he just said something to the unmarried is you keep your focus as it is. But now he says, verse 10, and this becomes complicated in verses 10 through 16. It can get real complicated, and you end up with a lot of people arguing about it. But the key is to keep it in its context and not be inserting things in that aren't there. Okay? So, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Okay, now, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. Okay. First thing we have to address here is this phrasing, yet not I, but the Lord. This whole thing is inspired, right? It goes back to the very beginning. Remember in chapter 2, one of the foundations of all this is inspiration. He's writing by inspiration. All these words are written by inspiration. We may have trouble sometimes with textual criticism figuring out which ones were the ones that were inspired, but this is inspired. Okay? So when he says, "Yet not I, but the Lord," he's referring to something more specific. Okay? And he's now, when you look ahead in verse 12, it's going to say, "But to the rest I, not the Lord, say." And people have taken that to say, okay, here's what's from the Lord, and the rest of this that's just Paul's opinion. That's not what he's saying. Okay? He is talking about what the Lord has addressed specifically versus what he has not specifically addressed. Okay? So the first thing is you're looking at, and therefore this should sound familiar with what the Lord has already said. So to the married I commend. So he's already given what he said to do with what it means if you're unmarried to keep your priorities proper, okay, and centered on God. Okay, so now the Lord said this, I'm not the only one. A wife is not to depart from her husband. Okay? So that's the first thing. And you come down and just to go ahead to keep it even. Notice that verse 11 at the end, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. He's saying this works both ways. So it's interesting because just like he said in addressing the sexual relationship in marriage, he says this works both ways, husband, wife in marriage too in this situation. Okay, so what's the first thing? Don't depart. Don't leave. And he uses different language because this would have been the most likely within the context of that day as far as the one who is in more of a position to initiate a divorce would have been the man. If you're talking about in Roman culture, women had a little bit more rights than what they would have. Like I said, very different than what Jewish culture had. But that's the first thing. So wife is not to depart, okay? Not to leave, or in this part, be separated, or separate herself from. But here's where it's more difficult in the wording. But even if she does depart, okay, now that I don't think is a good translation. So does anyone have does it word it a little bit different way? Okay, if she just leaves. That doesn't help. I appreciate it, but it doesn't help. The nature of this is it's passive, and technically it's an aorist. So what you have here is closer to how you normally would see this would be something more like even if she should be departed. Okay, yeah. Is the key thing I'm talking about is a situation in which it had already happened. Okay, it's a little, I realize it's a nuance. But you realize those kind of situations can exist. Okay? So you end up in this situation of where, don't leave. Okay, what am I to do though? He's covering, remember I said all those situations? He's covering a variety of situations. So, first of all, if you're married, don't divorce. Now, Jesus has an exception for this in Matthew 19:9. But he's saying, you stick it out. That's what he's saying. Okay, but you've got a situation, and if it could happen, okay, she should be departed. Okay, already away. Okay, what do you do in this situation then, Paul? Okay, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Those are your options. Okay, I came, you say, came a Christian, I was in this situation. Okay, what do I do? All right, your options are remain unmarried or be reconciled. So he's handled it. Okay. So now we get to verse 12. It says, but to the rest I, okay, so we've got a different situation. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother who has a wife who does not believe, okay, now you notice we got a different situation again, okay, who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. So this is strengthening what he had already said, but it's because it's a different situation. Now he's wanting to make sure you know that still goes even if the person is not a Christian. That not getting a divorce still applies. Okay? Don't do that. Okay, now this is going to be really important for what follows. Verse 13, and then we won't have time obviously to get to all of this, but I want to get the context in. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now, a key element before we get on to the next section next week is he's dealing with a situation where that person hasn't left. So it's said, okay, you could be in a situation where someone's skedaddled, right? It's a good old Texas word. Taken off. Okay. But in this case, someone is not a Christian, not a believer, but is content in the marriage. Okay. Well, good. Now, understand contextually why this would be a problem. Does that situation, are there challenges involved in that? Yeah, absolutely there are. there are a number of challenges. There are challenges in raising children. There are challenges just on what do you do on Sunday. There can be all sorts of challenges involved just upon the mindset and what your thinking is about what your priorities can be. There's going to be all sorts of challenges that go with it. But that's not a reason to get divorced. Okay? And so, especially if you have a number of situations, he doesn't get into the details as to whether or not, what this situation was specifically. Was this one person obeyed the gospel and the other has not so far? Was it that, and when did they marry? Was it that they, when was that person, converted? Was it beforehand or after marriage? Well, he doesn't say that because really it doesn't matter. He says, if you made that decision, now we have an argument to make later on, we'll get to about what to do in those situations. But that's what he's kind of saying here, is the big overriding principle is, no, you don't divorce. And that we need to see as our theme, and then he's handling all these ways in which things can come up and create problems, and that you have to handle as a result. Okay? No, it's a confusing class. Maybe a little bit more than normal. So appreciate your staying with me, but I wanted to give you some things to think about as we go through the text. Appreciate that, and we will pick up there next week.